Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the inner sanctum of one of the most secretive and powerful figures on the planet, the Grand Ayatollah of Iran. You're barefoot on a soft Persian carpet. The light filtering through latticed windows feels filtered through centuries. A white turbaned cleric adjusts his glasses across the room. And just that, a small, almost imperceptible movement, has a ripple effect that might decide oil prices, elections, or the fate of dissidents thousands of miles away. No army behind him, no Twitter rants, just robes, silence, and centuries of theological authority. This is no ordinary bedtime story. You're walking into a world where sacred texts replace constitutions, where sermons are state policy, and where one man's whispered ruling can redraw borders without firing a single bullet. It's a little spooky, frankly. And yes, you probably won't survive this if you forget that Supreme Leader means exactly what it says on the tin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a modest room in Tehran's Beit Rabari, the leadership house. No golden chandeliers, no military garb or velvet thrones. Just a scholar's desk, an old bookshelf, and a man in a black turban who doesn't smile often. This is where the real power in Iran lives, not in parliament. Not in the president's palace. You're in the gravity well now. The current Grand Ayatollah, officially called the Supreme Leader, sits atop Iran's strange political ecosystem like a spider in a very well-tied web. His power doesn't shout. It hums, vibrates, and pulses quietly through thousands of unofficial channels. You're trying to grasp it, but it keeps sliding sideways. Is he a politician? A religious figure? A monarch in disguise? He's all three, and something else entirely. In theory, his job is to protect Iran's Islamic character. In practice, he commands more levers of state than almost any leader on earth. He can overrule the president, dismiss judges, control the armed forces, and appoint half of the Guardian Council, the body that screens all political candidates. Oh, and he can also declare war. Casually. But if you're imagining someone with a Napoleon complex or dictator theatrics, stop. The Grand Ayatollah moves like a librarian, speaks softly, wears modest black robes. He'll give a quiet Friday sermon that makes global markets twitch. He doesn't need a podium, he's the podium. What makes this role so unique isn't just the power, it's the source of that power. You see, in Iran, it's not charisma or votes that matter most. It's knowledge. Deep, intricate, years of scholarly grind knowledge of Islamic law. The Grand Ayatollah is meant to be the most learned person in the country. And you don't get there by waving a flag. You get there by sitting in seminaries for decades, poring over ancient texts while everyone else is binging soap operas. But here's the twist that keeps scholars awake at night. The current Ayatollah, Ali Khamenei, wasn't even considered a top-tier religious scholar when he took power. Historians still argue whether he was even qualified to hold the title of Marja, the highest level of Shia cleric. Some say politics pushed him upward faster than piety. Still, once he got there, he stayed, like really stayed, over 30 years and counting. And despite everything, wars, revolutions, sanctions, internet memes, he hasn't lost his grip. If anything, he's tightened it. Now, don't mistake this for simple authoritarianism. It's more subtle. This is influenced by osmosis. Picture this. He doesn't ban social movements with tanks. He condemns them with a brief phrase. And suddenly conservative clerics across the country start nudging their followers away. It's like watching ink spread across water. Quiet, quick, complete. One quirky tidbit here. The Supreme Leader's office has a special fatwa room. Yep, a room where he issues religious rulings, some of which can legally bind the entire country. Imagine a government with a built-in hotline to divine law. And you're starting to get it. And unlike most world leaders, he doesn't have to worry about elections. Not really. He's appointed for life. And only a secretive body of clerics, the assembly of experts, can remove him. Spoiler. They never have. In fact, most of them were either appointed or approved by, you guessed it, him. The result? You've got a man at the top whose power isn't loud or flashy but is, let's be honest here, terrifyingly stable. While presidents come and go, the Grand Ayatollah remains. He is the institutional memory, the theological spine, and the ultimate firewall between Iran and any radical reform. Here's the thing. Even if the people vote for change, even if they scream in the streets or launch viral hashtags, none of it really matters if the Grand Ayatollah says, no. Because in this system, no isn't just a refusal, it's divine veto. And yet, paradoxically, many Iranians see him as a symbol of continuity, a steady figure above the chaos. Some believe his role preserves Iran from turning into another chaotic failed state. Others, especially the younger generation, see a rigid theocrat trapping the nation in amber. But love him or loathe him, you can't ignore him. Even the West, so fond of tweeting condemnations, treads carefully. After all, this isn't just a man in a robe. This is the node where religion meets geopolitics, where martyrdom mixes with missile strategy. And here you are, standing silently at the edge of his world, listening, watching, wondering how a man with no visible army, no public debates, and no flashy campaigns can bend so much gravity around himself. Welcome to Iran's quiet empire. You're back in time now, Tehran. Early 1979. The air smells like gunpowder and hope. You weave through crowded streets as chants echo between aging apartment blocks. Death to the Shah. God is great. Women in flowing chadors link arms with students in denim jackets. Billboards of the Shah have been ripped down or defaced. And shop windows are scrawled with graffiti, some holy, some angry, some both. Iran is on fire, but the flames are lit by prayer candles and Molotov cocktails alike. In the middle of this revolutionary chaos, a black and white poster flaps from a lamppost. It shows a man with a long beard, thick brows, and an unwavering stare. He isn't in Tehran. He's not even in the country. He's been exiled for years. But his voice, recorded on cassette tapes, smuggled in jacket linings, is everywhere. He is Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and within months, he will become the supreme leader of Iran. Before 1979, Iran was a monarchy, ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a king who wore military medals with as much flair as he accepted Western oil deals. He tried modernizing the country, land reforms, women's suffrage, education. Sounds progressive, right? Except he also tortured dissidents, banned political parties, and cozied up to foreign powers a little too much for the average Iranian's taste. And here's where the twist begins. The revolution that overthrew the Shah wasn't just secular or leftist, it was deeply religious. For decades, clerics like Khomeini had warned that modernization without morality was a hollow path. But their warnings were once seen as quaint, like grandpas scolding you for wearing jeans. Until the regime began to crack. You walk past a bookstore where bootleg sermons from Khomeini are sold under the counter. One tape is titled The Government of God. The idea? That clerics shouldn't just advise kings, they should replace them. In early February 1979, Khomeini returns to Iran after 14 years in exile. You're at the airport when his plane lands. People weep, some faint, others kneel on the tarmac. It's a religious rock concert, if the rock star was 76. Mostly silent, and looked like he hadn't smiled since 1954. But here's the spine-tingling moment. When the Shah fled and Khomeini came home. He didn't walk into a vacuum. He walked into a country already bubbling with revolutionaries, Marxists, nationalists, liberals, all expecting some form of democracy. Spoiler alert. That's not what they got. Khomeini, with eerie patience and velvet-gloved absolutism, outmaneuvered them all. Historians still argue whether he planned this from the start or simply seized the opportunity as things crumbled. But what's clear is that by the end of that year, Iran had transformed from a monarchy into an Islamic republic, with Khomeini not as president, not as prime minister, but as supreme leader. The title sounds like something from a dystopian novel, but it was rooted in theology. In fact, many clerics were initially skeptical of mixing mosque and state so directly. After all, traditional Shia Islam had long taught that scholars should stay out of power, advising from the sidelines while awaiting the return of the hidden imam, a messianic figure believed to someday restore justice. Khomeini rewrote the rules. He argued that until the hidden imam returned, Someone had to safeguard Islamic governance. So why not a jurist? A faqih? And if there must be one, then he must be the most pious, most learned, most incorruptible. Sound familiar? That argument became law, literally, in Iran's 1979 constitution. The newly created role, supreme leader, was modeled after Khomeini himself. And yes, he basically wrote himself into permanent power. Not bad for someone whose weapons were prayer beads and cassette tapes. Here's a quirky detail. The very first national referendum post-revolution didn't ask Iranians to pick a leader or vote for a party. It simply asked, "Do you want an Islamic republic?" That's it. No fine print. Over 98% said yes. Many didn't know exactly what it meant. Fewer still imagined it would come to mean what it did. As you walk through the aftermath of revolution, things start shifting. Newspapers close. Judges are replaced by clerics. Former allies of the revolution vanish or are imprisoned. Women who once danced in protest now face hijab laws. And Khomeini speaks sparingly. But every time he does, it's with biblical weight. And then come the hostages. In November 1979, a group of radical students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage. Khomeini doesn't just condone it, he praises it. The Islamic Republic tightens like a vice. Suddenly, Iran isn't just religious, it's revolutionary, anti-Western, anti-imperialist, and entirely shaped by one man's vision of divine governance. Even after Khomeini's death in 1989, the foundations he laid remained solid. His successor, Ali Khamenei, may have lacked the same charisma, but he inherited the same powers and slowly added more. But back in 1979, as you stand on the street corner watching murals of Khomeini go up next to Quranic verses and Kalashnikovs, you start to understand something bone deep. The revolution wasn't just about politics. It was about identity, about reclaiming morality from materialism, about building a government that kneels 5 times a day. And above it all, a single figure, cloaked in black, speaking of justice, sacrifice, and eternity, rose like a tide that swept away kings, parties, and borders, a tide still flowing today. You're sitting cross-legged now, on a woven rug in Qom, the holy city of scholars. Around you, books taller than your torso line the walls of a quiet seminary. The pages rustle softly as a dozen students, some barely past 20, murmur passages from centuries-old texts. They're studying the law, but not the kind with gavels and judges. This is fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, and tonight, you're going to meet the concept that built a country. It's called Vilayat-e-Faqih, literally, guardianship of the jurist. Sounds academic, right? But don't let that fool you. This idea, small enough to fit on an index card, is the cornerstone of the Grand Ayatollah's authority. Think of it as the theological engine that powers Iran's theocracy. So what does it mean? Exactly? Well, in traditional Shia Islam, there's always been a need for scholars, faqihs, to guide people on what is permissible, what is forbidden, and what lies in the murky in between. But for most of history, this guidance stayed personal, not political. The faqih was your moral compass, not your mayor. Then along came Ayatollah Khomeini, who asked a simple question. What if the most knowledgeable jurist had not just spiritual authority, but political power too? What if, until the awaited messianic figure, the Mahdi, returned, someone had to lead in his absence? And just like that, a theological theory became the basis for an actual state. You lean closer, brushing your fingers over a commentary written in the 1800s. It's thick with marginalia. The idea of a scholar temporarily assuming the imam's role wasn't new, but turning that role into a head of state position? That was revolutionary, literally. Khomeini didn't just propose that jurists could rule. He insisted they must. Otherwise, who would protect the faithful from corrupt kings, foreign invaders, and moral decay? In his view, the modern state was a raging river, and only the scholar could hold the dam. Historians still argue whether Khomeini truly believed this doctrine when he first penned it in the 1970s or whether it was a tactical weapon for justifying clerical control. Either way, it worked. And here's where things get twisty. Vilayat-e-Faqih wasn't universally popular among clerics. Many high-ranking ayatollahs saw it as dangerous overreach. After all, weren't they supposed to be neutral interpreters of divine will? Mixing politics into theology felt like adding hot sauce to holy water. But Khomeini had the charisma and the revolution. And in 1979, when the new Iranian constitution was drafted, Vilayat-e-Faqih became Article 5. During the occultation of the Lord of the Age, may God hasten his reappearance. The governance and leadership of the nation devolves upon the just and pious jurist. Translation? The supreme leader isn't just a figurehead. He's the embodiment of sacred authority in a temporal world. Not elected in the usual sense. Not accountable in the usual way. But divine, delegated, and deeply embedded. One quirky little detail? The original idea didn't even include absolute power. In Khomeini's earlier writings, the jurist was supposed to guide, not dominate. But post-revolution, the idea evolved. Suddenly, the supreme leader wasn't just guardian of Islamic law, he was guardian of everything. So what does this mean in practice? Imagine if your nation's constitution gave final legal authority to the country's top theologian. Imagine if Congress, the Supreme Court, and even the military all deferred, sometimes quietly, sometimes grovelingly, to that one man. That's Vilayat-e-Faqih in motion. It doesn't just shape laws, it shapes elections, foreign policy, educational curriculum, the daily choices of millions. From hijab regulations to satellite dish bans to nuclear negotiations, the supreme leader's opinion is the law, even when it's not written down. Still, Vilayat-e-Faqih isn't static. Over the decades, it's flexed to fit the times. Under Khomeini, it had revolutionary zeal, death to the West, export the Islamic uprising, sever old alliances. Under his successor, Ayatollah Khamenei, it's more bureaucratic and cautious. Less shouting, more chess. But make no mistake, the principle remains the same. One man, chosen by a council of clerics, rules in the place of the hidden imam. His legitimacy doesn't come from ballots or birthright, it comes from books. Thousands upon thousands of hours spent studying arcane points of Islamic law. And yet, there's a soft paradox in all this. You pass a modest tea shop near the shrine of Fatima Masameh. Two old men argue over soccer while a radio mumbles a fatwa from the supreme leader. They're not afraid, they're used to it. To them, the Grand Ayatollah is both distant and ever-present. He's the cosmic traffic cop you only notice when you run a red light. And despite the legal weight of his title, the office of supreme leader also relies on what Iranians call maqbuliyat, acceptability. Not popularity, exactly, but legitimacy in the eyes of the faithful. If that disappears, the robes and rings don't matter. So why does it still work? Partly because it promises moral clarity in a chaotic world. Partly because it's propped up by institutions you'll meet later, courts, guards, councils, and partly because, let's be honest, it's just hard to uproot something when it wraps itself in sacred tradition. But for now, you rest your palms on the rug, exhale gently, and consider what it means for a country to be led not by generals or CEOs, but by scholars of medieval law. In a world of tweets and tanks, Iran bets on Vilayat-e-Faqih, the rule of the robe. And you're just getting started. You're walking now, barefoot again, but this time through the echoing marble corridors of Iran's supreme leadership compound. It's quiet, too quiet. No red carpets, no gold leaf, no marble busts of the leader's face. Just bookshelves, prayer mats, and the faint aroma of rosewater and old paper. You glance over your shoulder and realize something strange. There are guards outside, but inside, power sits in silence. The Grand Ayatollah doesn't need to shout. His voice carries because it's rooted not in volume, but in sacred weight. And tonight, you're starting to understand, he isn't just a political figure. He's something far stranger, more than a man, less than a god. See, in most countries, power is handed to someone through the logic of elections, monarchic succession, or military takeover. You campaign, inherit, or conquer. But here, in the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader's legitimacy flows from something called divine representation. He's not the hidden imam, but he's as close as anyone can get. And that makes everything he says carry the shimmer of prophecy. Imagine being the guardian of the Islamic nation, in the absence of the messianic savior, the 12th imam, who vanished over 1,000 years ago and is still, technically, on his way. Until he returns, someone must hold the fort. That someone is the supreme leader. He doesn't just govern, he protects the divine timeline. You're starting to see why the Grand Ayatollah can make decisions that seem to defy logic, democracy, or even public opinion. His job isn't to make people happy, it's to keep Iran tethered to its sacred mandate. At least, that's the idea. And it's precisely why his presence feels so surreal. He's the most powerful figure in Iran, yet avoids direct confrontation, rarely gives interviews, doesn't debate, doesn't run for office. You may never hear his voice in a speech. But when he sends a letter to a president, or a fatwa to a nuclear scientist, it's like thunder wrapped in silk. One fringe detail? There's a particular tone the supreme leader uses when delivering edicts, known as lan-e-rabari, the leadership cadence. It's not just how he speaks, it's how slowly he speaks. Every word is deliberate, every pause a theological punctuation mark. Listening to it feels less like being addressed and more like being judged by a time-traveling professor from the 10th century. Still, historians argue whether this image of the supreme leader as an infallible jurist is more mythology than substance. Khomeiни's successor, Ali Khamenei, for example, was hastily promoted after Khomeiни's death in 1989. Despite not having reached the highest scholarly rank of Marja, his appointment required a quiet constitutional tweak and some strong behind-the-scenes persuasion. But once in power, he shaped the role around himself. Khamenei's genius wasn't in theology, it was in political balancing. He built coalitions with military commanders, bureaucrats, hard-line clerics, and intelligence chiefs. Over decades, he filled key positions with loyalists who saw him not just as a ruler, but as a moral compass in a confusing world. You pass a framed calligraphy verse from the Quran, likely chosen by the Ayatollah himself. These walls aren't adorned with his portrait, not always, but with ideals. Justice, piety, sacrifice. If your country had endured war, sanctions, assassinations, and uprisings, wouldn't you want a symbol that could outlast them all? And yet, the supreme leader is also oddly human. He's known to write poetry. He loves Persian classical music. He once suffered a grenade injury that left his right arm partially paralyzed. He often tucks it into his robe when speaking. There's a quiet vulnerability beneath the mountain of authority. But don't mistake softness for weakness. Because here's the real alchemy of his role. The supreme leader doesn't just control Iran's levers of power. He embodies the unity of mosque and state. He is both the pope and the commander-in-chief. And if that sounds impossible, that's kind of the point. Iran's constitution even requires the supreme leader to be just, pious, aware of the times, courageous, and a good administrator. Basically, Gandalf meets Machiavelli, with better scriptural references. So you ask, how does this play out in everyday life? Well, if a president proposes a policy that runs afoul of Islamic law, or, more accurately, the supreme leader's interpretation of it, that policy vanishes. If a general gets too ambitious, he's replaced. If a popular movement gains traction, he might issue a fatwa that shifts the national conversation overnight. And if you're an artist, activist, or cleric who questions him too loudly, let's just say, you'll find the boundaries of dissent are rather sharply defined. A peculiar tidbit, in official state photographs, Khamenei is almost always seated slightly higher than any other figure present. Subtle, but constant. Power in Iran is staged as much as it's wielded. And remember, he's not alone. Around him are dozens of institutions that serve as both amplifiers and enforcers of his will. You'll meet them soon, but none of them can override him. Ever. In this system, the supreme leader is the final authority not because he says so, but because everything around him is designed to ensure it. From the Revolutionary Guards to the Guardian Council. From the seminaries of Qom to the Friday prayer pulpits of small provincial towns. Every strand leads back to him. You step outside now, into the courtyard. Night has fallen. The call to prayer echoes from a nearby mosque. Above you, the stars flicker. The same stars the first imams once saw as they walked through the deserts of early Islam. And you realize something. In Iran, the supreme leader isn't just a person. He's a time traveler. A living thread connecting a 21st century state to a 7th century mission. And while presidents may come and go, parliaments squabble, and protesters rise, he remains. Still, listening, judging, guarding the flame. You're waking up now in the middle of a swirling bazaar. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. The scent of cardamom, copper polish, and sizzling kebab wraps around your senses like a silk scarf. But the real story tonight isn't in the alleyways or vendor shouts. It's coming from a plain beige mosque just around the corner, where a single cleric's Friday sermon is about to shift the ground beneath an entire country. Because here's the thing. When you think of revolutions, you probably picture guns and flags. But in Iran, the revolution didn't need bombs in backpacks. It had radios in briefcases, fatwas over loudspeakers, and an Ayatollah who, despite exile and censorship, weaponized sermons more effectively than most generals ever manage with tanks. You press your ear to the stone wall. Inside, the cleric is quoting Khomeiни's early speeches. But you already know the rhythm. You've heard it echo across time. It begins not with rage, but with sorrow. The tone is mournful, fatherly, deliberate, but don't let the tenderness fool you. These sermons are scalpel and sledgehammer both. The mosques of Iran, especially in the 1960s and 70s, weren't just houses of worship, they were political accelerators. The Shah's government underestimated them terribly. They thought the mullahs were dusty old men with too many rules and not enough rifles. But those old men had networks. Through the Haza system, an intricate web of seminaries and religious schools stretching from Qom to Najaf, clerics passed along coded messages. Political teachings hidden inside theological debates. Resistance embedded in lectures on virtue. And then, the cassettes. Yes, that humble invention, plastic, magnetic, barely the size of your palm, became a missile. Khomeini, from exile in Paris and before that in Najaf, recorded sermons and fatwas onto tapes. His followers smuggled them into Iran, duplicating them in basements, playing them in barbershops and taxis, slipping them under doors. One tape declared the Shah an enemy of Islam. Another condemned foreign powers. Another warned that the true Islamic Republic would only arrive when scholars ruled, not soldiers. Historians still argue whether the cassette campaign was spontaneous or a carefully orchestrated movement. But it worked. By 1978, tapes of Khomeini's voice were so widespread that his sermons became as recognizable as popular songs. You'd find kids humming the cadences, market vendors reciting his one-liners. One of the most famous, "We are not afraid of prison. We are not afraid of death. We fear only God." Meanwhile, the Shah tried to respond with censorship, arrests, and propaganda. But you can't bomb a voice. You can't jail an idea once it's turned into a ringtone in the hearts of millions. And then came the fatwas. If you've never heard the term before, a fatwa is a non-binding legal opinion issued by a qualified Islamic scholar. But in Iran's revolutionary context, they were anything but non-binding. When Khomeini issued one, it was less a suggestion and more a commandment, especially when the suggestion was, say, remove this tyrant. Quirky side note? In the early post-revolution years, there were so many fatwas flying around that newspapers published daily digests of them. It was like a national horoscope, but instead of love predictions, you got rulings on hairstyles, morality, and proper international diplomacy. Fast forward a bit, and you arrive at one of the most infamous fatwas of the 20th century, the 1989 declaration against Salman Rushdie for the Satanic Verses. Yes, that one. Khomeini was near death. He barely made public appearances anymore. But with a few words, he set off a global incident. The West howled. Bookstores were firebombed. The price on Rushdie's head became symbolic of Iran's willingness to assert theocratic authority beyond its borders. And even after Khomeini's death, the fatwa stood. That's the thing. Once a supreme leader speaks, truly speaks, it lingers. His words become permanent architecture in the national psyche. It's not just about law. It's about moral precedent. But not all of the supreme leader's messages are direct. Often, influence moves in quieter ways. You're now in a tiny village in Yazd. Friday prayer has just ended. The local cleric, a soft-spoken man with a cracked voice, has spent the last 10 minutes subtly echoing a speech from Khamenei. No citation, no hint of mimicry, just ideas, a warning against foreign infiltration. A reminder to remain vigilant against cultural decay. Every person in the congregation nods. Some are too young to remember why those phrases matter. Others know exactly where they came from. This is how the Grand Ayatollah governs, not by barking orders, but by setting the rhythm. Imagine a country where thousands of sermons each week all pull their notes from the same spiritual melody. Where one man's worldview shapes the theological lens of millions. That's power. Not the flashy kind, but the slow drip, empire-building kind. Still, none of this works without the aura of divine proximity. The supreme leader isn't merely respected. He is interpreted. People don't just listen to his words, they decode them. Was that phrase about foreign agents actually a reference to that reformist politician? Was the line about vigilant mothers a quiet jab at social media influencers? And here's where it gets surreal. Sometimes, silence is even louder. When the Grand Ayatollah chooses not to speak on an issue, it creates a vacuum. Is he pausing to reflect? Waiting for consensus? Or sending a coded message of disapproval by omission? People dissect his absences the way art historians study brushstrokes. One moment, just one, comes to mind. After the disputed 2009 presidential election, Iran erupted with protests. Millions in the streets. "Where is my vote?" they cried. And the supreme leader? He waited. Days passed. Tension built. Then he spoke, briefly. Coldly. His approval of the election result was measured. But final. The protests were crushed. No shouting. No screaming. Just a quiet sentence. A turbaned shadow in a palace few will ever see. Tightening his grip with a whisper. "You're inside the maze now." Not a literal one, though it feels that way. You've entered the layered, crisscrossed, and slightly claustrophobic architecture of Iran's state structure, a spiderweb of councils, ministries, foundations, militias, courts, and committees. And right at the center, still perfectly still, is the Grand Ayatollah. It's not a pyramid. It's not even a ladder. It's something stranger. A network designed to keep one man in place while making him appear. On the surface, distant from daily messiness. A web where every thread either ties back to the supreme leader or simply doesn't exist. Welcome to the spiderweb of power. You glance at a flowchart someone tried to make once. It looks like spaghetti crossed with a conspiracy theory. Every institution has an official name. Often something that sounds democratic or bureaucratic. But pull the curtain, and you'll find a cleric appointed directly or indirectly by the supreme leader sitting at the top of most of them. Let's start with the basics. The supreme leader is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That includes the regular army and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, a parallel military force with its own land, air, sea, intelligence, and cyber branches. The president, despite being elected, has zero control over these forces. You do the math. The IRGC alone has its fingers in everything from oil and construction to media and missile design. It even owns banks and football teams. That's right, clerically blessed capitalism. One of their most infamous arms, the Quds Force, operates mostly outside Iran's borders and reports only to the supreme leader. It's like if your country had a private military that also ran a chain of convenience stores. And how about the judiciary? The head of it is chosen by, you guessed it, the supreme leader. And that head, in turn, appoints judges and prosecutors who shape legal interpretation across the country. In theory, Iranian courts are supposed to uphold Islamic law. In practice, they uphold what the leadership defines as Islamic law, which can be very flexible. You take a detour through the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, which decides what movies can be shown, which books can be published, and whether your fashion choices pass the modesty test. The top officials here, too, either owe their positions to the supreme leader or work within boundaries he has drawn. Now you're passing through the assembly of experts, a council of clerics who, in theory, can dismiss the supreme leader. Sounds bold, right? Here's the catch. The candidates for this assembly are vetted by the Guardian Council. And half of the Guardian Council's members are appointed directly by the supreme leader. It's like designing a lock where the key comes pre-installed. Quirky but real? There's a council in Iran literally called the Expediency Discernment Council of the system. You can't make that name up. It was originally formed to resolve disputes between the parliament and the Guardian Council. But it's slowly evolved into a kind of all-purpose policy shop. Who appoints its members? The supreme leader. Some serve until death. And yes, he can expand or shrink its power as he pleases. And don't forget the Supreme National Security Council, the body responsible for Iran's defense and foreign policy decisions. The president sits on it. So do military officials, but its ultimate policy directions are ratified or overridden by the supreme leader. He's like the invisible editor of every major geopolitical paragraph. Still, you're wondering, how does one man manage all this? He doesn't, not directly. That's the genius. Power is delegated across a vast system of loyalists, most of whom owe their positions to his patronage. Many are clerics. Many are former Revolutionary Guard officers. Some are both. It's like a chessboard of bishops and knights, all playing the game for him even when he's not visibly moving a single piece. Historians still argue whether this was Khamenei's master design or the natural result of needing to secure a shaky post-Khomeini regime. But either way, by the 2000s, the spider web was complete. And here's where it gets spooky. The web is flexible. When reformists try to change the law, the Guardian Council strikes it down. When a president gets too ambitious, the judiciary opens an investigation. When public protests swell, state media, controlled via loyal cultural offices, shifts the narrative. The system doesn't always crush rebellion. It often absorbs and reroutes it. You see it clearly during elections. Yes, Iran holds them. People vote. They even campaign with posters and slogans. But the candidates are pre-approved. And many of the key decisions are made elsewhere, deep in this web. Still, it's not all iron and shadow. Some parts of the system genuinely try to govern, educate, or build infrastructure. Ministries handle traffic, agriculture, energy. But even these work within invisible walls. Overstep. And the spider twitches. You stop by a small state-run newspaper office. A young editor tells you, quietly, that every major headline must align with the line of the leader. Not an official law, just a fact everyone knows. Every journalist in the building can name the topics that are off-limits: supreme leader's health, IRGC corruption, political prisoners. These are not printed, they are intuited. A strange, fringe detail? Even architecture isn't spared. There are design guidelines for public buildings and city squares. Spaces must reflect Islamic values, which are, of course, defined by clerics close to the leader's orbit. Imagine trying to build a subway entrance and being told your tiles are theological or problematic. And yet, the spider web doesn't feel heavy at first. It's subtle, wrapped in tradition, ceremony, and the appearance of stability. It's only when you try to move against it, or even think too loudly, that you feel the resistance. It's late now. You walk through Tehran at night. You see families in the park, children chasing soccer balls, old men sipping tea by roadside carts. Life moves on, as it always does, but above it all, wrapped invisibly around every office, every sermon, every court ruling and classroom and campaign speech, is the hum of the web. And in the center, quiet, patient, watching, sits the Grand Ayatollah. You're not in a palace now. You're in a dusty barracks on the outskirts of Tehran, where young men in mismatched fatigues train beneath portraits of martyrs and clerics. The paint is peeling, the boots are worn, but the discipline? Impeccable. The salute, the chant, the rhythm of their march, it's all for something far larger than nationalism. You're meeting the real backbone of the supreme leader's grip on Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or, if you want to sound like someone who's definitely on a watch list, the IRGC. Born in the smoke of revolution and baptized in the fire of war. The IRGC is not just a military force. It's a state within a state. A sword in one hand and a ledger book in the other. And it answers, not to parliament, not to the people, but directly to the supreme leader. Back in 1979, when the revolution swept aside the Shah, Iran's regular army was suspect. Too tied to the monarchy. Too westernized. Too shaky. So Khomeini called for a people's army to defend the revolution. The IRGC was formed not just to protect borders, but to protect ideology. And that made all the difference. You watch as a group of fresh recruits are lectured not by drill sergeants, but by clerics. They're not just taught how to fight. They're taught why the revolution matters, why the West is suspect, why the supreme leader is a spiritual commander as well as a national one. And this connection isn't abstract. The IRGC literally pledges allegiance to him. They don't just obey orders, they obey a worldview. You've seen loyalty before, but not like this. This is theocratic loyalty, laced with martyrdom. One mainstream fact. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, the IRGC proved its value on the battlefield. Poorly equipped but ideologically zealous, they fought trench by trench, sometimes using human wave tactics. It was horrifying, but effective. Thousands died. Posters of them still line the walls of bazaars and schoolrooms. And their reward? After the war, they didn't just get medals. They got contracts, construction projects, import licenses. Entire industries were handed over to protect the revolution. Today, the IRGC controls companies in telecommunications, oil, construction, agriculture, you name it. It's like if the Pentagon also owned Walmart, Exxon, and Netflix. A quirky tidbit. One of the IRGC's construction arms is named Khatam al-Anbiya, meaning, seal of the prophets. It's one of the largest engineering firms in the Middle East. It builds roads and mosques. Sure, but also missile silos and nuclear facilities. Try putting that on a business card. But the IRGC isn't just digging trenches and drilling oil. You're about to meet its darker twin, the Quds Force. This elite branch handles operations outside Iran. Everything from smuggling weapons to proxies in Iraq and Syria, to training Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon. Historians still argue whether the Quds Force functions as an extension of state policy or whether it runs its own covert empire. What's certain? Its late commander, General Qasem Soleimani, was so influential he was often called Iran's shadow foreign minister. Until a US drone turned him into a martyr in 2020. And guess who cried at his funeral? The supreme leader. On live television, an almost unheard of public display of grief from a man so often composed. Even clinical. It wasn't just the death of a general. It was the loss of a loyal sword-bearer. You could hear it in the silence between the leader's words. Still, don't imagine the IRGC as a single-minded machine. It's a vast, sometimes fractious organism. There are internal rivalries, corrupt officers, rising stars who imagine themselves as successors to the revolution's legacy. But so far, none have dared defy the supreme leader. Because he's more than their commander-in-chief. He's their raison d'etre, their sacred lodestar. Without the supreme leader, they're just soldiers. With him, they are guardians of destiny. And let's not forget domestic affairs. When protests erupt, like in 2009, 2017, or 2022, the IRGC's besieged militia rolls out. These are civilian volunteers, often teenagers or retirees, trained to monitor and manage internal dissent. They flood the streets. Sometimes they hand out water. Sometimes they swing batons. You see it in real time. A crowd gathers outside a university. Women with headscarves half off. Men chanting slogans about freedom. Then, like shadows on wheels, the besieged arrive on motorcycles. Masked, moving as one. The tension is thick. No bullets, just stares, pressure. The protest wilts, like a flower under cold mist. One fringe fact? Besieged units sometimes organize religious theater performances. Dramatizations of martyrdom. Passion plays where ancient imams die noble deaths. And enemies always look suspiciously like modern reformers. Yes, indoctrination with stage lighting. And above it all, watching, absorbing reports, shaping policies, is the supreme leader. His office receives weekly, sometimes daily, updates from IRGC commanders. The public rarely sees this pipeline. But it exists, humming quietly behind every news broadcast and troop movement. He doesn't issue marching orders through speeches. He doesn't need to. His vision is embedded in training manuals, in military oath ceremonies, in the very air of those beige barracks. It's in every line of poetry the cadets memorize. Every morning roll call, every budget meeting for a missile project, purely for defense, of course. You leave the barracks at dusk. There's a statue of a young soldier with a broken rifle and a raised fist. No name, just a quote. The leader is the soul of our resistance. You wonder if it's metaphorical. It's not. In most countries, the military serves the state. In Iran, a large part of the state is the military, and that military serves the supreme leader. And if that sounds like too much power for one man, remember, in Iran, he's not just a man. He's the manifestation of continuity. of God's law, of the only revolution that stuck. And his sword is very, very sharp. You step out of the shadows of military barracks and into the opulent quiet of a very different kind of fortress. This one's made of carpets, crystal chandeliers, and men in robes debating legal minutiae deep into the night. You've entered the Guardian Council, the constitutional brain of Iran's theocracy. It doesn't look like much, just 12 men, seated in a semicircle, flipping through legal texts, but these 12 are gatekeepers. And the gates they guard? Every law, every election, every candidate, every future. Let's unpack the setup. The Guardian Council is half clerical, half judicial. 6 members are Islamic jurists appointed directly by the supreme leader. The other 6 are legal experts, nominated by the judiciary chief, who himself is also appointed by the supreme leader, and approved by parliament. So, really, all roads still lead back to that one black turban. Their job? To make sure everything in the Islamic Republic stays halal, constitutional, and, of course, aligned with the leader's worldview. They don't interpret laws, they decide if laws are even allowed to exist. Like a holy editorial board with veto power over every article before it's printed. Picture this. Parliament passes a bill that seeks to loosen hijab requirements or improve rights for religious minorities. The council reviews it, frowns slightly, and quietly stamps, un-Islamic. Boom. Dead bill. No fuss. No filibuster. Just theological ghosting. Historians still argue whether this model was truly intended to be so restrictive, or whether its expansion over time was a defensive reaction to reformist pressures. But regardless of intent, the effect is clear. The Guardian Council isn't just a filter, it's a firewall. And here's where it gets especially spicy: elections. Iran has them. Presidential, parliamentary, even for local councils. People campaign, posters go up, debates are held, but before anyone gets on a ballot, they must pass through the Guardian Council's approval process. Every candidate is vetted for loyalty to the revolution, to Islam, and, let's be honest, to the supreme leader himself. In the 2021 presidential election, for example, hundreds of candidates applied. The council approved just 7. It's like auditioning 1,000 singers, then letting through only the ones who agree to lip sync to the same song. Some call it democracy with training wheels. Others say the wheels were confiscated a long time ago. Still, the system produces surprises now and then. Sometimes reformist-leaning candidates squeak through. Sometimes the public rallies behind them. But even then, their power is strictly limited. Laws they propose can be blocked. Reforms they advocate can be reconsidered. And when push comes to shove, the supreme leader can simply outlast them. And yes, if you're wondering, this vetting process also applies to the Assembly of Experts, the one body technically empowered to select and remove the supreme leader. The council approves who gets to run for that too. So really, the only people allowed to judge the leader are people who were already pre-approved by the leader. If that sounds like a celestial catch-22, well, welcome to Iran. You might be thinking, how does this not collapse under its own weight? Because the council isn't just a tool, it's a symbol. A signal that the Islamic Republic is not here to bend to public pressure or international norms. It's here to defend something deeper. Something eternal. That's the sales pitch, at least. One fringe detail. Council members are often seen sitting in total silence during televised parliamentary debates. They rarely speak, but everyone knows they're watching. It's like having a panel of Jedi Masters looming over a high school debate team. And occasionally, they do speak, usually in dense theological language or coded phrases. A term like, preserving the values of martyrdom, might be their way of rejecting a trade agreement. A phrase like, guarding the sanctity of hijab, might be how they dismiss reforms on women's dress codes. The art of saying no without sounding like it. Now you find yourself in a press room, watching a hopeful presidential candidate answer questions. He's careful, every sentence laced with disclaimers. Of course, under the guidance of the supreme leader. In accordance with our revolutionary principles. His enthusiasm feels real, but his boundaries are visible, like the edge of a carpet rolled out just far enough for a safe dance. And then there's the public. Many Iranians know the council is more filter than referee. Some vote anyway, hoping for incremental change. Others boycott, tired of the illusion. But everyone feels the council's presence. It's not just a legal body. It's the ideological compass of the system, forever pointing toward Khamenei and the man who lives there. Yet here's the real twist. Some members of the council are brilliant scholars. They've memorized the Quran, debated philosophers. They believe deeply in what they're doing. In their minds, they are not suppressing democracy, they're protecting it from the corruption of secularism, consumerism, and chaos. To them, filtering candidates is not undemocratic, it's morally necessary. And in the end, all of this serves one purpose: to maintain the supreme leader's role not as a ruler bound by political tides, but as a moral constant. Elections may sway, parliaments may shift, but the line of the faqih must remain straight. You exit through a side door now. The halls of power stretch behind you. Silent and self-assured, a muezzin's call rises faintly from a mosque down the street. And you realize, in this republic, the ballot is real, but the ballot box has been carefully trimmed to fit the shape of the robe that rules above it. You duck into a quiet university courtyard, hoping for a breather from councils and commanders, only to find yourself surrounded by books, blackboards, and revolutionaries in disguise, because tonight, you're diving into the ideological forge of the Islamic Republic, the seminaries of Khamenei, where the robes are thick, the beards are long, and the debates? Fierce, ancient, and strangely modern. This is where supreme leaders are born, not in hospitals, but in hazas. The haza, or Shia seminary, is not just a school. It's an ecosystem. Imagine Oxford, Hogwarts, and a chess dojo rolled into one, but with jurisprudence manuals from the 9th century and constant surveillance from above. Khamenei is the most famous of these seminaries, teeming with thousands of students from all over the Shia world. Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Nigeria, you name it. They're here, wrapped in beige and black turbans, whispering Arabic conjugations like spells. And in this maze of books and mosques, a small handful of students eventually rise to become maraji, sources of emulation. These are the top clerics whom millions of Shia Muslims look to for guidance. But only one, eventually, becomes Wali-e-Faqih, the supreme leader. You tiptoe past a classroom. A professor is lecturing about ijtihad, the process of independent reasoning in Islamic law. You hear the words, ethics, sovereignty, and Instagram in the same sentence. You weren't expecting that last one, were you? Because while the robes haven't changed in centuries, the questions have. How do you apply a 7th century hadith to 21st century AI? How do you weigh ancient verses against Bitcoin, climate change, and TikTok? It's in this space that future leaders learn the skill that keeps the system alive. Reinterpretation. Not just rote memorization of scripture, but the art of shaping law to fit the moment, without ever admitting you're bending anything. One mainstream fact: before becoming supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei studied under Khomeini in Najaf and later taught in Qom. He wasn't the most prominent scholar, not even close, but he had a gift for synthesis. For merging theology with geopolitics. For speaking the language of both minarets and missiles. Still, historians argue whether his scholarly credentials would have held up without political backing. Some clerics whispered that he rose too fast, that he lacked the deep jurisprudential authority of a true marja. But in 1989, the Assembly of Experts made its choice, and Khamenei's rise became a blueprint for future clerics. Don't just master the law, master the system. In Qom, students learn to navigate this duality. They study Quranic law and constitutional clauses in the same breath. They debate taxation, apostasy, driverless cars, and whether genetically modified wheat violates Islamic food purity standards. Yes, really. A fringe detail? Some seminaries even have electives on Western philosophy, Plato, Nietzsche, even Kant, taught through an Islamic lens. The goal isn't to embrace the West. It's to decode and diffuse it. And yet, Qom is not a monolith. Not every cleric here wants a theocracy. Many believe in the spiritual separation of mosque and state. They think Khomeini's idea of Vilayat-e-Faqih went too far. That religion should guide, not govern. Some even argue, softly, behind closed doors, that the supreme leader's power has eclipsed the original spirit of Shia humility. That he risks becoming more king than jurist. But you'll never hear them say it into a microphone. You pass through the courtyard of the shrine of Fatima Masameh. where pilgrims shuffle silently, brushing fingers against gold latticework. Above them, in a small office window, a senior cleric watches. His presence reminds you, Kham is not just an academic hub, it's a political nerve center. When the supreme leader speaks, the echo doesn't go straight to the people. It first ripples through these seminaries. Here, scholars debate his rulings. Clerics filter them down to local mosques. Friday's sermons get adjusted. Debates get recalibrated. If the supreme leader is the head of the system, Kham is its bloodstream. And it's also its warning bell. In the past, when unrest has threatened to boil over, Kham's silence, or worse, its criticism, has forced Tehran to reconsider. When popular clerics start to question the system, the regime listens, not always kindly, but it listens. One unforgettable moment? In the early 2000s, reformist-minded seminarians in Kham began circulating ijtihad papers questioning the political interpretation of Vilayat-e-Faqih. The regime cracked down hard. Arrests, suspensions, and a quiet reminder that scholarship here isn't entirely free. Still, the dissent simmers. Because the same system that empowers the supreme leader also creates the intellectual tools to challenge him, eventually. That's the paradox. The seminaries that anointed him could, one day, be his soft undoing, and the leader knows this. That's why he nurtures alliances here, appointing loyal clerics to head major institutions, funding friendly seminaries, rewarding quiet compliance with influence and funding. But even with all that, he can't control every voice. There's always the risk that some student, buried in a dusty volume at 2 a.m., will discover an interpretation so compelling it can't be ignored. That a soft-spoken scholar might one day stir the people more deeply than a televised fatwa. But not tonight. Tonight, the lamps of Kham flicker in the desert wind. Students argue about ethics and energy policy over saffron tea. Somewhere, a young cleric sharpens a thesis that might, someday, reach the ears of power. And above it all, back in Tehran, the supreme leader sleeps, aware that the minds forged here are his greatest strength, and his most unpredictable variable. You're walking now along the edge of a protest. It's not a full-blown riot, not yet. More like the electric pause before a summer storm. A crowd is gathering in a city square. Someone's holding up a sign. A woman's hair flutters in the breeze. Uncovered, there are camera phones, cautious footsteps, a few hopeful chants. And somewhere nearby, behind tinted windows and tall walls, the supreme leader is already being briefed. Because in Iran, every whisper of unrest ripples upward. No matter how small the protest, no matter how remote the village, the system is built to detect tremors and send them straight to the top. Tonight, you're entering the shadowy world of surveillance, suppression, and control, the infrastructure of Kham, as the regime sees it. And the supreme leader? He is its architect and beneficiary. It's not all secret police and dark alleys, though there's a bit of that. Most of it is legal, institutionalized, often even televised. You might be surprised by how out in the open it all is. Let's start with the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, MOI. Think CIA meets Ministry of Magic, but with more prayer rugs and fewer accountability committees. It tracks dissidents, censors media, monitors religious minorities, and sometimes, just makes people disappear. It's big, it's quiet, and it serves directly under the supreme leader's authority. Historians still argue whether MOI operates as a loyal servant or a semi-independent force. But what's certain is this: its top officials don't breathe without watching the leader's face for subtle nods of approval. And then there's cyber surveillance. Iran has built one of the most sophisticated internet monitoring systems in the world. Known unofficially as the Halal Internet, this digital net filters websites, scrubs social media, and can throttle or shut down web access nationwide in minutes. Protesters? Blocked. Journalists? Shadow banned. Memes of the supreme leader wearing sunglasses? Vanished before you can even chuckle. You peer into a government control room. It looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, banks of screens, blinking lights, analysts in headsets murmuring into radios. But what they're watching isn't missile telemetry, it's Instagram stories, tweets, WhatsApp chats. Your emoji could be on a state list by now. A quirky tidbit? During certain unrests, the government has deployed text message warnings to individual protesters. We saw you at the rally. Do not return. It's not a phone call. It's not even a knock. It's just a ping, a reminder that they're watching. And above it all, there's the rhetoric of soft power. You see, the supreme leader doesn't have to be brutal. Often, his most effective tool is shame. He condemns sedition, Western cultural infiltration, or enemies of the revolution, in carefully worded speeches. He rarely names names, but everyone knows who he's talking about. Remember that young woman with the uncovered hair? Within hours, state media might feature a panel of experts discussing the dangers of immorality, complete with Quranic references and doctored statistics. They won't say her name, but she'll get the message. And here's the irony. Much of this infrastructure was built after 2009, when mass protests nearly cracked the system. Dubbed the Green Movement, it began as an election dispute and grew into a nationwide demand for accountability. Millions marched. Posters of the supreme leader were burned. It was the closest the Islamic Republic had come to internal collapse. The response? Swift, efficient, and chilling. Thousands were arrested. Some disappeared into Evin prison, Tehran's most notorious detention center. Others were forced to confess on television. I was misled, they'd say. Eyes hollow, voice flat. The enemies of Islam manipulated me. But something else happened too. The regime upgraded. Surveillance went digital. Protest laws were tightened. Revolutionary Guard cyber units were expanded. And the supreme leader stopped pretending the people's voice was always welcome. He began speaking more openly about enemies within, cultural war, and the need for ideological purification. Still, the control isn't absolute. Protests keep happening over gas prices, water shortages, women's rights. The people haven't gone quiet. They've just learned how to shout in whispers, code words, private groups, coordinated flash rallies that disperse before security forces arrive. And the leader? He's watching, always watching. You walk past a mural now, 20 meters wide. It shows the supreme leader in front of a mosque, hand raised in blessing, sunlight radiating behind him. Below the image, a quote: "The people are the body. The leader is the soul." But ask around, and you'll hear quieter opinions. That the soul is tired. That the body is restless. One mainstream fact: the supreme leader often gives annual addresses on the Persian New Year. No ruse. But lately, these speeches are defensive. Less triumph, more warning, less celebration, more fatigue. He speaks of plots, soft war, and the necessity of vigilance. You hear it in his tone. The anxiety, the pressure, power, it turns out, doesn't bring peace. It brings weight. And the weight is increasing. Because this system of control depends not just on fear, but on belief. The belief that the leader is wise, just, chosen. And in the age of satellites and smartphones, belief is harder to sustain. A fringe example? In 2022, Iranian pop stars began releasing protest songs. Not angry punk, quiet, haunting melodies about lost freedom. The songs spread like wildfire. The regime tried to ban them. But how do you censor a melody once it lives in the heart? You find yourself back in the square. The protest has ended. The signs are gone. But the tension remains, like the final chord of a song that refuses to resolve. And above it all, in his office, the supreme leader listens, not just to the silence, but to what might follow. He knows, you can crush a protest. But can you silence a heartbeat? You're standing now in the Foreign Ministry's grand marble foyer, where velvet ropes and flagpoles line the corridors, and portraits of revolutionary leaders stare down at every handshake. But you're not here for a passport or a photo op. You're here to trace the long, quiet fingers of Iran's foreign policy. And to understand how, behind every treaty, threat, or truce, there's always the same guiding hand. Spoiler: it's not the president's. In the Islamic Republic, foreign policy may have a ministry, but it has only one master, the supreme leader. And that changes everything. Most governments allow diplomats a fair amount of flexibility. Ambassadors are trained to react quickly, negotiate creatively, and sometimes improvise when a crisis hits. But in Iran, the red lines are drawn long before the meeting ever starts, and they're drawn by a man who rarely leaves his compound, rarely grants interviews, and rarely forgets a grudge. You watch as a young diplomat fidgets with his tie in front of a camera crew. He's delivering a statement about nuclear talks. It sounds conciliatory, hopeful, almost Western. But you notice the subtle script, phrases carefully recycled from the Supreme Leader's earlier speech. This isn't diplomacy, it's performance. Let's rewind to 1979. Iran's foreign policy was flipped like a rug in a storm. Gone were the Western alliances of the Shah. In came Khomeini's vision of an independent Islamic resistance against imperialism. The slogans were loud, the embassies were stormed, and the message was clear: Iran was no longer anyone's pawn. But that didn't mean isolation. Far from it. Under the Supreme Leader's long shadow, Iran became a master of asymmetric diplomacy. Less about treaties, more about networks. Less about embassies, more about influence. One mainstream example: Iran's backing of Hezbollah in Lebanon. What started as a tactical alliance in the 1980s has evolved into a deep ideological brotherhood. Hezbollah isn't just a militant group, it's an extension of Iran's theocratic vision, tailored for Arab audiences, and it reports directly to Iran's supreme leader. The same goes for Iraq. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iran moved swiftly to fill the vacuum, building alliances with Shia militias, funding political parties, and embedding itself into Iraq's future. Again, not through Tehran's foreign ministry, but through the Quds Force, through the Supreme Leader's invisible reach. Historians still argue whether these foreign entanglements serve Iran's national interest or merely prop up the ideological ego of its ruling clerics. But no one doubts who authorizes the playbook. And then there's the nuclear file. Perhaps no single issue defines the Supreme Leader's approach to global power more clearly. Technically, Iran's nuclear program is overseen by scientists and regulators. Politically, it's managed by diplomats. But spiritually, strategically, every crucial decision runs through one office. During the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, then President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif were the public faces of negotiation. They smiled, they signed, they posed. But in the background, Ayatollah Khamenei monitored every clause. He issued cautious support, sprinkled with deep mistrust. And after the US withdrew in 2018, he was the first to say, "I told you so." Quirky detail? While the Supreme Leader has condemned nuclear weapons as un-Islamic, he has never ruled out nuclear capability. It's a subtle difference, one that gives him moral high ground while keeping the world guessing. And the guessing game is part of the strategy. Iran under the Supreme Leader doesn't shout. It whispers. It winks. It speaks in parables and red lines, forcing world powers to decode meaning from metaphors. A statement about resistance economy might be about oil sanctions. A poem quoted in a Friday sermon could signal a shift in foreign alignment. You duck into a media room. On-screen, state channels are broadcasting another Khamenei speech, calm, measured, with a cascade of calligraphy behind him. He talks about global arrogance, a phrase you've heard before. It means America. It always means America. But there's a smile in his voice now. He knows how to wield disdain like a scalpel. Iran's alliances also reflect this balance of defiance and diplomacy. With Russia, there's military cooperation, especially in Syria. The two nations don't share ideology, but they share enemies. With China, there's economic partnership, a massive 25-year deal for infrastructure and oil that signals Iran's pivot eastward. These aren't friendships, they're strategic hedges, and every step is signed off by the Supreme Leader's foreign policy advisors. Yet he's careful not to tie Iran too closely to any superpower. The message is clear. Iran follows its own path, one based on Islamic independence, a phrase woven through schoolbooks, military chants, and international speeches. But here's the quieter truth. Even as Iran projects strength abroad, the Supreme Leader's foreign policy is deeply defensive. He remembers the CIA-backed coup of 1953. The war with Iraq, the sanctions, the assassinations of Iranian scientists. His entire strategic mind is shaped by the belief that the world is out to sabotage the revolution. And that's why he must be the one to steer the ship. A president might be too soft. A foreign minister too trusting. Only the leader, in his view, has the historical memory and divine insight to keep Iran on course. You exit the ministry and enter the bazaar. Merchants haggle over fabric and pistachios. Foreign tourists browse silver jewelry. It feels worlds away from drone strikes and diplomatic cables. But listen closely, and you'll hear the foreign policy doctrine repeated in everyday conversations. We don't trust the West. We don't need them. We have God. We have the leader. Whether you believe it or not, it's real. Because foreign policy in Iran isn't just about borders. It's about survival, identity, pride, and one man, one black turbaned cleric, holds the map. You're at a funeral now. Not just any funeral, one with streets flooded in black, weeping crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, and rhythmic chants rising like smoke from thousands of lips. There are flags, portraits, speeches, a coffin wrapped in the Iranian flag and draped with white lilies. And above it all, a massive banner with the face of the man everyone calls leader. Because tonight, you're peering into something far more powerful than law or bullets. You're looking into myth. The supreme leader of Iran doesn't just command. He embodies. He doesn't just lead. He represents. And to millions of Iranians, particularly the devout, the rural, the war generation, he is a living symbol. Wrapped in history, scripture, and blood. This isn't politics. This is pageantry. This is sacred theater. Let's rewind to understand the stage. Shia Islam is uniquely poetic, deeply historical, emotionally charged, and rooted in a tradition of martyrdom. Its central story is a tragedy, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala. A noble stand, a doomed resistance, a family slaughtered in the desert. And from that grief came the Shia ethos, resistance against tyranny. Even at the cost of death. Now take that emotional engine, plug it into a modern state, and you begin to see why Iran's supreme leader isn't just a politician. He's a continuation, a protector of Imam Hussein's legacy. In the minds of millions, he is the one who ensures Karbala is never repeated. At that funeral you're watching, the man being buried might be a soldier, a scientist, or even a cleric, but in every speech, you hear the same refrain: he died defending the revolution. He was a soldier of the leader. His blood will water the roots of resistance. Historians still argue whether the blending of martyrdom culture with state ideology has strengthened national identity, or made dissent feel like heresy. But either way, the result is chillingly effective. Questioning the supreme leader becomes more than political rebellion. It becomes spiritual betrayal. You visit a state-run museum now. Walls lined with portraits of martyrs. Some died in the Iran-Iraq War, others in Syria, some in murky accidents. Each image is paired with a quote from the supreme leader, a prayer, or a poetic excerpt. The lighting is soft, the air reverent. Children are brought here on school trips to learn that to serve the leader is to walk in holy footsteps. And then there's Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Every year, the supreme leader addresses the nation, not with fireworks or champagne, but with a serious, poetic sermon. His language is lofty, often cryptic. He chooses a single word to define the coming year: resistance, progress, justice, and like a royal astrologer, he casts the tone for the national psyche. Quirky detail? The leader's annual Nowruz speeches are sometimes decoded like horoscopes by officials, analysts, and clerics, eager to extract hints about policy shifts. One year he said, production, and suddenly factories became sacred again. You walk through a conservative neighborhood in Qom. There's a small shop selling prayer beads, turbans, and tiny portraits of the supreme leader, framed in gold or glass. Some sit on home altars, next to Qurans and candles. In these homes, the leader isn't feared. He's loved, revered. His image shares space with imams. For some, he's the next link in a divine chain. Still, not everyone buys the myth. In northern Tehran's cafes, among artists and university students, you hear another language: cynicism, dark jokes, oblique criticisms. They don't mock the supreme leader directly, that would be dangerous, but they question the machinery. The cult of mourning, the way politics wears a clerical mask and calls itself holy. But the myth is resilient, because it's constantly nourished through televised sermons, Friday prayers, schoolbooks, and puppet shows. Yes, puppet shows. You once saw one where a brave little boy, loyal to the leader, outwits a villainous foreign spy who tries to bribe him with candy and blue jeans. This blend of piety and propaganda runs deep. The Basij, Iran's volunteer militia, regularly holds commemorative events in schools and parks. celebrating martyrs and praising the leader. At one, you see children dressed in camo, reciting poems. A girl barely 10 chants, "I will give my life for the leader and the light of Islam." It's both moving and unsettling. And yet, it works because it taps into something very old, the desire to believe in meaning beyond ourselves. In many cultures, that meaning comes from flags or constitutions. In Iran, for a significant portion of the population, it comes from theology filtered through one man's voice. One mainstream fact: the supreme leader rarely appears in public spontaneously. His appearances are meticulously choreographed. The lighting, the camera angle, the cadence of his speech. And when he weeps, whether for a martyr or a natural disaster, it's broadcast on loop, with swelling music and slow zooms. Because in myth, tears are strategy. But there are cracks in the surface. You recall the massive funeral for General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. The crowds were real, the grief intense, but mixed in were signs of something else: fatigue, tension, whispered questions. Who else must die for this myth to survive? When does mourning become manipulation? Still, the supreme leader endures, not just because of control or theology, but because of narrative. He is the calm in the storm, the wise elder, the last word, the face that promises continuity when all else feels chaotic. And for a nation battered by sanctions, wars, and uprisings, sometimes that illusion of stability is enough. You stand once more at the funeral. The speeches are done, the prayers complete, the crowd begins to leave. But the posters remain, the banners ripple in the breeze. And in every corner, you hear it again: the leader is not a man. He is the message. You're climbing stairs now, wide, marbled, dimly lit, and as you ascend, you realize you're not just entering a building. You're entering a vault, a nerve center, the office of the supreme leader, known in Persian as Bait-e-Rabari. From the outside, it looks like any other government compound: high walls, armed guards, nondescript doors. But on the inside, this place is anything but ordinary. It's the epicenter of the Islamic Republic, a complex web of bureaucracy, ideology, and control, all spinning around a single man. You arrive at the top landing, quiet, immaculate, and humming with invisible power. Unlike presidential palaces in other countries, there's no opulent fanfare here, no gold thrones or dramatic staircases. But the institutional gravity? Immense. The supreme leader's office isn't just a workspace. It's a command bridge, complete with clerical advisors, military liaisons, intelligence conduits, and, perhaps most intriguingly, the shadow bureaucracy that keeps the regime aligned with his vision 24/7. Want to understand how he manages to rule a country of 86 million without ever running for election or holding daily press conferences? It's this place. This office has departments for domestic affairs, foreign policy, media oversight, clerical relations, charity distributions, judicial feedback, economic monitoring, basically everything, but none of it is published in detail. No org chart on the wall, no public transparency. It's all quiet, sealed, and deeply personal. You peek into one hallway. A cleric in white turban whispers to a Revolutionary Guard commander. Another. A woman in a conservative chador delivers sealed documents to a secretary who doesn't look up. Down another. A young clerical aide edits a speech draft on an aging desktop computer. No phones ring here. The silence is policy. Historians still argue whether the supreme leader's office has become a de facto shadow government, or whether it's just a glorified clerical secretariat. But when you examine Iran's decision-making patterns, it becomes obvious. This place is where threads are pulled, sometimes subtly, sometimes with force, and it's all run by a tight-knit circle of advisors known as the Bait. These men, some clerics, some technocrats, are gatekeepers. They manage access, filter information, and shape how the leader sees the world. You want to reach the leader? First, you go through his chief of staff, then maybe the council of advisors, then the trusted clerical inner circle. And even if your message makes it through, don't expect a direct answer. The leader prefers to speak through actions, through gestures, sometimes through silence. Quirky fact: some of the most important fatwas or directives from the supreme leader are issued not as public speeches but as handwritten notes, short, cryptic, passed between officials like relics. One famous note reportedly changed the course of Iran's nuclear negotiation strategy with just a few lines. And yet, the bait is not immune to internal tensions. Power attracts rivalry, ambition. Over the years, multiple aides and deputies have been dismissed, retired early, or simply faded into the background without explanation. Some say the supreme leader keeps the bureaucracy in a low simmer, never letting one faction grow too bold. You're guided into a private chamber now. This is where key Friday sermons are drafted, where Quds Force memos are reviewed, where reports from provincial governors are quietly analyzed for signs of unrest or compliance. One mainstream fact: Ayatollah Khamenei reportedly receives daily intelligence briefings, summaries of press sentiment, and updates on foreign developments, not through newspapers, but through tailored digests prepared just for him by loyal advisors. His worldview is curated, but never uninformed. And this matters, because when he speaks, it affects everything: markets, morale, missile deployments. That's the power of centralization. When your words become law, every syllable matters. But don't mistake this setup for paranoia or detachment. The Supreme Leader's office also runs charitable foundations, known as bony ads. These semi-governmental organizations redistribute wealth, fund hospitals, sponsor scholarships, and provide aid during crises. Ostensibly charitable, but always political. Loyalty is rewarded with bread, medicine, and housing. You pass by a meeting room. A young cleric is showing a PowerPoint presentation to three older men. The screen reads, "Religious Messaging Strategies, ages 14 to 24. You blink. So even here, in this austere sanctum of theological power, there are focus groups, analytics, trend reports. Because the leader's office isn't just reacting to the world, it's trying to shape it. And it does, through speeches, policies, and subtle nudges. Like when a senior advisor visits a newspaper editor and suggests, gently, that coverage of Western movies might be reevaluated. Or when a provincial cleric suddenly receives funding to build a new mosque, days after giving a sermon that praised the leader's patience and wisdom. Or when the annual education budget tilts toward religious sciences, after a mysterious recommendation from above. It's soft power, laced with hard consequences. And then you see it. The leader's private prayer room. Small, carpeted, no gold, just a shelf of well-used Qurans, a lamp, and a window overlooking a garden. This is where decisions are made that ripple across continents. Because in the Islamic Republic of Iran, power is personal. It flows from one man, one voice, one prayer at a time. You step out into the garden. The sun is setting, birds chirp, a fountain bubbles gently, and somewhere, behind one of these curtains, the supreme leader is reviewing a file. Maybe it's a diplomat's report. Maybe it's a village complaint. Maybe it's a poem. Whatever it is, you can be sure of this: when he answers, the whole country will hear it, whether he whispers or stays silent. You're back on the street now, where old men sip tea on rusted stools, and motorbikes buzz past faded murals. The air smells like rosewater and engine oil. A boy walks by clutching a plastic soccer ball. A shopkeeper folds a newspaper, glances at the sky, and mutters something about the economy. And that's your cue, because tonight, we're stepping into the final frontier of power, economics. Or more specifically, how the supreme leader, without ever printing money or signing a trade deal himself, holds economic gravity in the palm of his hand. The Iranian economy is a beast of contradictions. Rich in oil, gas, and human capital, poor in investment, trust, and predictability. It's like a grand old house with marble floors, but termites in the beams. And guess who holds the master key? The supreme leader's control over the economy isn't always direct, but it's profoundly structural. His fingerprints are on every budget, every subsidy, every resistance economy slogan printed on the backs of milk cartons. Let's talk structure first. There's the Seted, officially known as the execution of Imam Khomeiни's order. Think of it as a state-run mega-holding company, controlling everything from telecoms to pharmaceuticals to luxury real estate. Created post-revolution to manage abandoned properties, it quietly morphed into an empire. And who oversees it? You guessed it, the office of the supreme leader. Then there are the bony ads, those quasi-charitable foundations we tiptoed past in the last section. Ostensibly designed to help the poor and honor the martyrs. These organizations now control billions in assets, all largely tax-exempt and unaccountable. They build hospitals, sure, but also own car factories and import goods. Their leaders? Appointed directly or indirectly by the supreme leader's inner circle. Historians still argue whether this parallel economy is a clever workaround for sanctions or a dangerous breeding ground for inefficiency and corruption. But either way, it's here, and it's deeply loyal. You pass a bakery where a queue wraps around the block. People joke about air sandwiches, that's bread with nothing in it. But behind the laughter is fatigue. Inflation bites, sanctions suffocate, and yet, the state's message remains oddly confident. That's the power of the resistance economy, coined by the supreme leader himself. It's a strategy, or maybe a philosophy, built around self-reliance. The idea: Iran must weather sanctions, produce locally, and reject the consumerism of the West. The phrase shows up everywhere, on billboards, textbooks, even cereal boxes. One mainstream fact: in 2014, Khamenei outlined a detailed 24-point economic doctrine emphasizing domestic production, knowledge-based industries, and reduced oil dependency. But for all its nationalist poetry, implementation has been mixed. And here's the twist: while the leader champions economic resistance, he also decides how much resistance is too much. He holds final authority on key trade decisions: when to open the valves, when to shut them, when to smile at Europe, when to scowl. You duck into a shop. The shelves are half-stocked. The vendor waves his phone in frustration. The currency just lost another few percent in value, again. The economy lurches like a tired beast. And people adapt. That's the quiet genius and tragedy of the system. The supreme leader doesn't need to fix the economy to maintain power. He just needs to make sure no one else can fix it without him. Take the nuclear deal. Reformist President Rouhani staked everything on it. Hopes soared. Businesses prepped. Then the US pulled out. And the supreme leader stepped in with an "I told you so," reasserting control over every foreign trade whisper. A quirky tidbit? The leader's speeches on economic self-reliance are often delivered with handcrafted Iranian goods on the table beside him: honey, saffron, Persian carpets. A not-so-subtle reminder: we have what we need. We don't need them. But the people? They feel the squeeze. Unemployment among youth is high. The rial is volatile. Skilled professionals emigrate in waves, draining talent like water from a cracked cistern. And still, many whisper that real reform is impossible, because economic reform requires political reform. And political reform requires confronting the man in the black turban. You hear it in bizarre conversations. Why should I invest if tomorrow a fatwa could shut my business? Why should I study finance if all the banks are owned by clerics? Why should I build when I can't even speak? Yet despite all this, the economy staggers forward, not booming, not collapsing, just surviving. You watch a man unload crates of pomegranates from a truck. His shirt clings to his back with sweat. The market smells sharp and sweet. The cash he earns today might be worth less tomorrow. But he shows up anyway. Because what choice does he have? That's the psychological hold. Hardship not as failure, but as proof of faith. Suffering becomes patriotic. Sacrifice becomes sacred. This bread may be stale, they say, but it's ours. And when things get too tense, the leader blames enemies, infiltrators, or economic sedition. It's never the system, never the structure, always the shadows. But in those moments when the curtain slips, when even regime officials admit corruption, waste, and mismanagement, you see the tension rise. And you wonder, how long can myth outpace hunger? Still, the leader remains. You return to the street. Night has fallen. Neon signs flicker over kebab shops. A man tunes his radio, hoping for good news. A boy counts coins in his hand. And somewhere, in a heavily guarded office, a silent figure reads a report about wheat imports. He doesn't touch cash, but every rial bends toward him. You're in a hospital corridor now. Pale green walls, a faint smell of antiseptic, and the low murmur of state television playing from a wall-mounted screen. Nurses in headscarves wheel carts past closed doors. A security guard taps his fingers on a clipboard, looking half bored, half alert. Somewhere in this building, maybe upstairs, maybe below ground, the supreme leader of Iran is aging. His walk is slower now. His voice, more gravelly. Public appearances have thinned, but his grip? Still ironclad. And as the years pass, the question grows louder, whispered behind closed doors, tapped out in cautious code on secure apps, murmured in quiet kitchens late at night. What happens when he dies? It's not just a biological event. It's a systemic earthquake. Because this isn't a country with term limits and peaceful transitions. This is a state built on charisma, consensus, and carefully calibrated fear. And when the man at the center of it all vanishes, everything will tremble. Let's look at the mechanism first. The supreme leader is technically chosen by a clerical body called the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member panel elected by the people, but vetted heavily by the Guardian Council. On paper, they review the leader's performance and select a successor when needed. But historians still argue whether this body has ever operated independently. Many of its members are elderly, conservative, and closely aligned with the current regime. Some haven't spoken publicly in years. Others owe their seats to the very system they're supposed to regulate. Which means that succession planning is less public process, more private chessboard. In recent years, speculation has centered around a few potential names: high-ranking clerics with political experience, revolutionary credentials, and enough religious authority to satisfy Iran's powerful seminary class. Some even whisper that a committee could lead in the interim, a shared stewardship until a clear successor emerges. But that raises another question. Can a theocracy survive without a towering theocrat? You flash back to 1989. Khamenei's death stunned the nation. The black-turbaned father of the revolution was gone. But the system adapted. The assembly moved fast, selecting Khamenei, a mid-tier cleric with modest theological standing but strong revolutionary ties. It worked, barely, and only because Khamenei quickly built a power base, rewrote the constitution, and cultivated a myth around himself. But now, the stakes are even higher. Today's Iran is more fractured, more connected, more suspicious of authority. Its youth grew up under sanctions, slogans, and slowly fading promises. They watched uprisings burn briefly before being smothered. They've memorized the slogans, but don't always believe them. Quirky tidbit? In online forums, some Iranian youth refer to the supreme leader with coded emojis, a black turban, an eye, a lock. It's both reverent and defiant. A subtle way of discussing power without naming it. You walk past a government building. Security is tighter than usual. Rumors swirl. Is the leader ill? Was that recent video live or pre-recorded? Did he really wave, or was it edited in? In a system where so much is built on the illusion of permanence, fragility is a national secret. One mainstream fact: Iranian state TV always keeps a few pre-recorded tributes ready. Montage reels with slow-motion footage, Quranic recitations, and stirring music, not just for the supreme leader, for every major official, just in case. Because when the moment comes, optics will matter more than truth. There's also the fear of power vacuums. The Revolutionary Guard, which answers directly to the leader, might try to assert more influence. Reformists might push for structural change. Hardliners might double down. Foreign powers will circle like vultures, nervous, hopeful, suspicious. And the people? Some will mourn. Some will weep in the streets, just as they did in 1989. Others will sigh in relief. Still others will wait, carefully, silently, for what comes next. Because here's the thing. No matter how powerful the leader is in life, his death unlocks possibilities the system tries desperately to contain. You remember the stories of what happened after Stalin died, or Mao, or Franco. The rituals, the tears, the recalibrations, the behind-the-scenes power grabs. Iran may claim to be different, spiritually guided, divinely protected, but humans are still humans. And power abhors a vacuum. You sit now in a quiet garden. The call to prayer echoes faintly from a nearby mosque. The wind rustles through mulberry trees. And you think of legacy. What does the supreme leader leave behind? A nation both proud and weary. A revolution both mythic and rusting. Institutions both devout and brittle. And a people who've lived for decades in the long shadow of one man's voice. He leaves order, but also stagnation. Unity, but also silence. Faith, but also fear. And in that space between memory and future, the next chapter waits, unwritten, uncertain, just like you.